Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well on this Thursday afternoon. We're going to do a Rashi from the fifth Aliyah in Parsha Vaetchanan. In the fifth Aliyah actually picks up right after the section of Matan Torah, the whole section of the Aseres HaDibros, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. I'm doing it from Sefaria today rather than the Al HaTorah website that I usually do it from because it had a different version of the Rashi on this pasuk, which cut out a significant part. And so I guess a debate textually about what's included in this Rashi. But that's perhaps a study for another time. But I liked what it had to say in the fuller version, which is what's included in most Chumashim. So I came over to this Sefaria. But at the end of the whole section about Matan Torah, as Moshe is recounting this event, he says, "Es hadvarim ha'ela diber Hashem el kol kalchem bahar mitoch ha'esh." All of these words, all of these things, these 10 commandments, these Aseres HaDibros, are what God spoke to the entire Kehillah, to the entire gathering of the Jewish people on the mountain, in the midst of the fire, in the midst of the cloud, in the midst of the fog. And this is how he qualifies the sound. What did it sound like when God was speaking these things to them? Kol gadol velo yasaf. A big voice, a grand voice, velo yasaf, that didn't yasaf. We'll come back to that in a second. And we wrote them on two boards of stone, or Hashem wrote them on two boards of stone and gave them to me. Y'all came to me, said, we heard this voice, it's the voice of God, we can't stomach it, no one can listen to the voice of God and live, and therefore why should we die? You should teach us the rest of the mitzvahs, as the story goes. Fine. Coming back to this, the description of God's voice is very interesting. Kol gadol velo yasaf. A big voice, that makes sense. Everything here is big, everything here is old, it's anah.
Absolutely.
Everything here is big, everything here is loud, everything is grand. So it makes sense that the voice would be gadol. That makes sense. But what does lo yasaf mean? And it didn't yasaf. Yasaf comes from the shoresh, from the roots, either asaf, to gather, or lehosif, to add. Likely here, lehosif. The lo yasaf, and it wasn't added to. What does that mean? It wasn't added to, or it wasn't additional some way. So Rashi says lo yasaf. Kimitargaminan velo pasik. The Targum Onkelos here on Yasaf translated as lo pasik. It didn't stop. Lo Yasaf. It didn't stop. What does that mean over here? What does it mean that God's voice was big and it didn't stop? Because human beings can't say everything they want to say in one breath. Their voice, their language, their speech is always by its nature interrupted because we have to take breaths in between. We can't sustain ourselves through one entire speech without stopping, without taking a breath. But God's voice is not like that. God doesn't need to pause. So this was this very unusual voice when God spoke. It was gadol, it was big. And what was most distinctive about it, which is surprising to the people because they had never experienced this before, is it was lo yasaf, it was lo pasik, it never stopped. It just kept going and going. It was one continual voice, one continual speech without any pauses, without any breaks, without any breaths in between. That was what was miraculous about it. That was distinctive about it because it was something they had never experienced before. Umishalo haya posek, lo haya mosif. So he tries to explain why the Targum calls Yasaf, which comes from the Shoresh, Lahosif, to add, translates as Lo Pasik, it never stopped. So he's saying it never stopped, and therefore it didn't need to be added to. Lo Yasaf, there was nothing more God needed to add. There was nothing more he needed to say after the Kol came out. Why? Because it was Lo Pasik, it was never ending. Everything was said in one breath. And therefore, lo yasaf, nothing was added to it afterwards. It was one speech, one davar, one kol, velo yasaf, and nothing more needed to be said. Ki kolo chazak v'kayam le'olam. And Rashi sort of introduces another spin over here, which is his voice is strong and kayam le'olam, and existent forever. Then he says another explanation, lo yasaf lo hosif lehera'oso to bepumbi. Lo yasaf means it never happened again in history. So you have three different takes, so to speak, over here on lo yasaf. The first one is lo yasaf, it wasn't added to because everything was already said. The second one is lo yasaf, meaning it would never be added to again, meaning there would never be another voice of God like this again, because this one would last forever. This one would be le'olam. This would be an everlasting word. There never needed to be another one to come because it was relevant forever. Similar, right? Lo pasik, the first explanation of Rashi, means it never needed to be added to because everything was said in one breath. The second thing, also, it never needed to be added to because it was eternal. It was eternal words, right? So they're similar. And then the third one is a little bit different. Lo hosif lahiraos beoso pumbi. Lo yasaf means also it never needed to be added to, but it was more like it would never happen again, rather than it never needed to be added to. The first ones by implication also mean it never would happen again, right? Because this is one word and it would last forever, it would be eternal, never needed to be added to, it would never happen again because it was sufficient for the rest of time. But the third one is a little bit of a different slant, which is the reason why is not because it was all said or because it was eternal, but rather this was just like a one-time event. God would never allow this to happen again. He would never have his voice heard in such a public manner again. So, and that's actually similar to the way that Ibn Ezra states it a little more clearly over here. Lo yasaf, ki ze haya pam achas. This was a one-time event. He says it a little more clearly than Rashi, but I think that's what the third explanation of Rashi is really saying over here as well. So really three different takes on Lo Yasaf, which helps to explain it. Whatever you explain it as, number one, number two, or number three, what is being conveyed here is the uniqueness of this voice, and that's not surprising because that's the theme of this whole passage. This is a one-time event that would never occur again, both because the people ask for it to stop, but also because there would never be an experience like Matan Torah again. That's evident even in the physical form, the Eish, the Anan, the Arafel, the Kolos, the shofar, everything that was happening over here was grand, was great, was unique, including the voice, which was Lo Yasaf, would never happen again, never needed to be added to again, and was unique in terms of it being one continual voice as opposed to an interrupted voice like the human voice would be. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day, everyone.
Pleasure, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a nice day.
You too. Be well, everybody.